Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Garibaldi Red podcast, a Nottingham Forest podcast. And as Forest have been busy again in the transfer window, signing Alex Moreno on a season-long loan from Aston Villa, an option to buy at the end of it. He's the 31-year-old, the Spaniard, who had fallen slightly behind new signing Ian Maatsen and Luca Digne in the pecking order at Villa Park. So that's why Forest have made their move on their man, and they've been very interested recently as well. Ross Wilson, in the statement when Forest announced him, said that he's been a player the club have targeted for a long, long time, and he was targeted before Nuno even arrived through the door. So Forest have finally got hold of him. It's a positive signing. Mark, before we get a bit more insight on him, just what you make of him, and really, he's we talk about stats on this podcast, but you look at the stats and you look at what a lot of Villa fans have been saying about him, and this seems like another positive piece of recruitment from the club.
Yeah, it's interesting, Max. We talked about Eddie Nketiah at length and about how the Arsenal fans are kind of lukewarm on him, and accordingly, the Forest fans are not quite sure what to make of that potential signing too. With Moreno, you have the complete opposite. I think you have Aston Villa fans overwhelmingly saying he's a class player. They're sad to see him leave. Obviously, it's on loan to begin with. I don't think it's an obligation to buy, right? I think it's just an opportunity to buy after the loan. Yeah. And I think if he shows up and rocks up in Garibaldi, chances are he'll end back up at Villa Park at the end of the season and probably be a part of their plans then this next season. But he has 40 appearances in the Premier League. Again, he's become a fan favourite with Villa. I think because he's both a good defender and also offers something offensively as well. Dare I say, Stuart Pearce-esque. Not from free kicks and penalties and the like, but he does bomb up and down that left-hand side of the field, provides a good number of assists, has scored a decent number of goals from that position over the years, including his last season with Real Betis, where he helped them, of course, secure the Spanish Cup, the Copa del Rey, an unlikely victory, which he was a big part of. So I think it's a great addition, and I think it gives us options. I don't know if he can play out the right as well, but we need additional depth, period, in the fullback positions. So I think picking him up on loan is very shrewd. Yeah, and I'm excited by that.
Right, let's go. And I recorded a little bit of a chat the other day with our producer Dan, who is an Aston Villa fan and runs a Villa podcast. Now Dan knows plenty about Moreno, so we had a chat with him, and it was nice for him to come on the podcast for once rather than producing it. Dan, thanks for joining us from the Claret and Blue Aston Villa podcast, somebody that's followed Alex Moreno quite closely. First of all, I guess, what do you make of his departure? I know a lot of Villa fans are saying that it's kind of, the reason you've got rid of him is because obviously you've got Ian Maatsen in now, which some Villa fans will argue probably is a better left back for you. But I suppose, what do you make of the season-long loan? And obviously he still could be a Villa player in a year's time.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, the left-back situation that's kind of developed at Villa over the last, 2 years, I suppose. There was a sense and a feeling that Luca Digne would be the one that would end up leaving at one stage. Obviously, he's a high earner, joined from Everton for a relatively sizable fee under Steven Gerrard in the summer, I think, of 21 or the January, I can't remember. When Unai Emery first joined the club in 2022, his first signing was Alex Moreno in the January window. And we did a podcast towards the back end of that first season, titled something like, I wish I had it in front of me. It was something along the lines of like, Alex Moreno is transformational for Aston Villa, or something like that, because he was so crucial to the way that we wanted to play going forward. And we'll come on to kind of strengths and weaknesses in a little bit. But it was Emery's first signing. He was very impactful from the off, allowed us to play in a different way. And that kind of opened the door to thinking, well, we've got our left back now, like Luca Digne is surplus to requirements. Moreno is 30. He's Unai Emery's man, if you like. So Luca Digne, high earner, he'll be out the door. Alex Moreno then gets an injury, hamstring injury, I think it was, and he's out for a little bit. And during that summer then, the talk is that Luca Digne will be the one to go. I think there was some interest from Saudi Arabia clubs. And again, that felt like the natural conclusion. But the injury problems that Moreno had, I say problems, that probably oversells it a little bit, but the issue that he had, he just didn't quite seem the same player afterwards. And Luca Digne found his way back in the team, and he had a great season last year. Luca Digne, he was very, very good, and he kind of put the financial side of it to one to one side and think, well, yes, he's a high earner, but for like PSR concerns and FFP and whatever else, but he's good. Like he's served a purpose for us. Luca Dean, he's been very, very good. So Ian Maatsen joins the club this summer for 37 million. So he is Villa's number one left back now. Obviously, you can't spend that kind of money, and he's not first choice. So effectively, you've got two left backs, or three if you include Moreno as a loanee still. There's two that are attacking and one that is a bit more defensive. Luca Dean is the one who's a bit more defensive. Moreno and Maatsen are the attacking fullbacks on that left side. You can't have both. You can't have three left backs playing for you on that amount of money and those transfer costs. So one of them had to go. Luca Dean is difficult to get rid of because he's a high earner, as I've said. Ian Maatsen has just joined. So that kind of just left Moreno free to go by default, really. I think Emery really likes him. We as Villa fans really liked him. But after that injury, he just wasn't quite the same player for us. I don't know whether it was a confidence thing or maybe a bigger long-term issue, but his place in the team just kind of fell by the wayside a little bit. So I think Villa now have two profiles in a defensive-minded fullback in Dean and then an attacking-minded fullback in Maatsen, and that leaves Moreno free to go. And I actually think Forest is a good fit for him.
A lot of people have been saying that, and I saw obviously, Moreno played for Real Betis, so obviously Emery followed him quite closely to bring him in as his first signing. You mentioned there the injury. Almost just before that injury, what were his standout moments, really? Can you pick any? And almost talk us through kind of how you saw the player, because before we started recording this, you were saying that, you thought he was a really good addition. And obviously you mentioned there the podcast you did about him being transformational for Villa.
Yeah, it's quite big words, isn't it, that? Because then 6 months later, it's Luca Dean's back in. What happened? Yeah. He was very important for us. It's a little bit behind the curtain here for people watching, by the way. I produced this podcast, so it's very weird being on it now all of a sudden. So because I'm the editor, basically, I'm going to put a graphic on screen to help me emphasise this point I'm going to make. Having Moreno allowed us to play a certain way of football, that our back four was Moreno on the left, Pau Torres, Diego Carlos centre half, and then Ezri Konsa was playing right back, who is, most will know, is a centre back really. But that allowed us that if you got the shape of the team, the left back will push on and basically play as a left winger. Moreno very, very far forward. If you've got a front man attack of Bailey and Watkins, Moreno's right up there with them on the left hand side. But that allowed Konsa to push back in as a back three. So rather than it be that Konsa was a right back who was going up and down himself, Konsa pushes into the middle. Pau Torres and Carlos move over a little bit. And Villa are effectively playing a back three, and Moreno is playing as a winger. Luca Dean can't really do that. He did have to do it at some points last season because we still play the same way. But Dean, as we know, is not as good going forward as Moreno is, I don't think, which is why we've signed Maatsen. But that was what Moreno's role was, to get forward as much as possible, get to the byline and cut the ball back across. You asked me like a standout moment. There isn't really one that I can think of. Like, that assist was great. He got a couple of assists in his first season. I don't think he got any assists last season, but he scored a couple of goals. I think there was a header against either Brentford or Sheffield United, and a volley from close range against one of those sides as well. But that is what he'll want to do: get forward, get to the byline, and cut a ball back across. He won't kind of sit David Beckham-esque and whip in balls from deep. He wants to get to the byline and cut it back across, a low cross along the floor, and that is, if you're going to play that way, and he hasn't got any kind of serious injury problems or confidence issues, I think that's very fruitful for you. I don't know what your left side looks like. I'll ask you to tell me in a second, but if there's a space for somebody to bomb on, stay forward and stay high, I think that is where Moreno comes into his own. Defensively, yes, he's not an amazing left back. He's going to have his issues. He's not physically the strongest. He's not the tallest player, but he is quick. So if he has got to make a recovery run, he can get back. But he wants to play further forward. There was times where we spoke about whether Dean could play left back and Moreno plays in front of him at left wing when we had injury concerns. So when we're down to the bare bones, can Moreno start as a left winger? Well, he's playing that anyway. That's where he wants to be. So I don't know how Forest's left side looks like and left back options currently are. But if you're going to be playing on the front foot and allowing somebody to bomb forward, then Moreno is a perfect fit for that, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's what Forest will most likely do. I mean, it's a bit of an odd one because I think in particular the left side, obviously Forest have Olarena there at the minute, and then Nico Williams is first choice right back. But other than that, in terms of the fullback options, we haven't got a lot of depth, and we've talked loads, obviously, on the Forest podcast before about having the squad depth in those positions, and I think it's one that Forest needed to strengthen. I think the likely scenario is Ola Aina moves to right back. he's kind of the first choice right back. Nico Williams drops to the bench, and then you have Moreno as first choice left back. I also think obviously Anthony Elanga on the left hand side is a big thing with those two working together. Not that obviously they've worked together before, but I think in terms of, you just mentioned about someone bombing forward, the attacking options and having that pace on the left side, I think the link up play could be special.
What's Elanga more likely to do? Is he a winger that will cut inside, or does he stay wide as well?
A bit of both, but I think more Elanga stays wide, to be honest. I think that's more of his...
You want players to combine, obviously, down that same side, but I would worry about them occupying the same space. Villa played with the Jacob Ramsey or Morgan Rogers off the left, who are going to cut inside and play onto their right foot, leaving space for Moreno to get past. So if Elanga is hugging the touchline as well, that can still overlap and cause problems, but I just worry about them maybe kind of getting in each other's way a little bit.
Interesting. And in terms of his age as well, Dan, do you think that's a concern? 31?
I don't know. He's obviously on the wrong side of 30, I suppose, that you would say. But I think, as John said recently on one of our podcasts, it's not Football Manager or FIFA 24, whatever it's called these days, that once a player hits 30, it's like, right, it's time to sell them. They're no good anymore. Like, players play at a high level well into their mid-30s. I think he was 31 in June, so only recently 31, I suppose. It's just that hamstring injury. I've got some stats. I've got a screenshot in front of me. Hamstring injury in 22-23, missed 118 days. And it just says a minor knock in 23-24. I can't remember what that was. Missed 46 days at the back end of the season, so April to May. So he missed the end of the season, basically. Missed 8 games in both those injury periods. If that's a recurring thing that he's going to have problems, then a player that relies on pace and bombing forward, if he doesn't quite trust his body, then age, I suppose, becomes a concern. But if he's fit and he's over all those things mentally as well, then I wouldn't be too concerned at 31. If he was 36 or 37, maybe I'd answer differently then. I'm nearly 29 myself, mate, so 31's not old, okay?
Yeah. You know what? I was about to say that when I started following Forest when I was younger and just started being a football fan, I always used to say to my dad, I always used to think 30 was really old because that's when players would retire. So, and it just didn't go down well that when, you'd meet someone in the 30 and I think, they're quite old. Right, back to, so would you say his main weaknesses are probably that injury side to him? Not saying that he's injury prone, but obviously you mentioned that he's had quite a lengthy time out on the sidelines.
Yeah, possibly. I think that's probably an obvious thing to throw his way, just because it's unproven a little bit whether he's over them, because he missed the back end of last season. So what's his summer been like? What's his pre-season rehabilitation been like? Will he come in and play against Southampton? I don't know. I doubt it, to be honest, but I suppose you never know. With football, he might take a bit of time to get up to speed, possibly. In terms of what he offers on the pitch, I suppose he didn't always cope well with Villa's high line. In terms of maybe concentration or getting back or keeping up in the right positions. But if Forest aren't playing a high line, I won't be too concerned about that. I think I would question is if you are a team that is going to sit deep and sit back and kind of camp on the edge of your own area and be very defensive. I'm not sure he's the player for that. He wants to be going the other way more often than not. So I think in games when Forest are expected to have the ball, push forward and create chances, Moreno will thrive in that. If you're playing somebody like a Liverpool or an Arsenal, and you're going to be under the cosh a little bit, those were sometimes the games where we'd see Dean come in as a more defensive option. So whether that's how you juggle your defensive line, then maybe that's a weakness.
We'll see. Do you think he could score against Villa? It's probably written in the headlines, isn't it, you think?
Oh, it's a loan, isn't it? So he won't be able to play against Villa.
Yeah, that's a good point, yeah.
I was going to ask you about the structure of the deal, because obviously he was linked with Forest, wasn't he, before he even joined Villa? So this isn't necessarily, I know people don't like stuff like this, but maybe he isn't a Nuno man, if you like, because Forest were linked with him before Nuno anyway. So in terms of you kind of finally getting somebody that you wanted for a long time is obviously a good thing for Forest, and something that you should be happy with as fans, I suppose, that your hierarchy, your scouts, your chief, whoever, think this guy is worth having and worth pursuing, and you finally got your man. The loan with the option to buy is interesting from a Villa perspective, because it's loans, it's wages off the books for us, but doesn't really do much for us financially. What that option to buy is as well, we're not aware. I think we signed him for something like 10 or 12 million euros. So he's 2 years older than that, at least, by the time the loan ends. So I can't imagine that fixed fee being more than £10 million.
It's quite interesting because Ross Wilson who's had a big part to play in Forest's recruitment so far. He's kind of the chief. He is the chief footballing officer. I think that's his exact title. And he speaks after every transfer. And in the statement announcing Moreno, Ross Wilson talks about how he's a player that Forest have followed closely for a few years. And I think it's quite interesting. I think he was probably one of Cooper's targets just before Cooper went, and then obviously it didn't happen for whatever reason. But I think Nuno, being a Portuguese manager, I think he's probably seen him before, watched him lots before, in Spain at times. So I think it's a positive move, and I think that he'll hopefully slot in nicely.
Do you think there's ever any chance of you going to a back three under Nuno? Because obviously he did that at Wolves a lot. It would suit someone like Moreno because he's already positioned further up the pitch anyway. Yeah,
possibly. I just think I think even though Forest at the minute, albeit he didn't play last week because he was suspended, which was annoying, he got carried over, but you've got Milenkovic now, the Serbian central defender, you've got Murillo, you've got Nico Williams, you've got Ole Aina, you've got now Moreno. All these players almost what I think would suit a back three. I actually just wonder whether it's almost a confidence thing from Nuno, whether he can trust, because Forest have still suffered defensively. We still suffered against Bournemouth, conceding quite late on. There was moments in that game where defensively Forest were shaking. It was the story of last season. I think we spoke to you when we did the Villa preview last time, and that was Forest's biggest weakness as a side, was defensively, and was defending set pieces and and almost just being able to have confidence in the back line. So maybe Nuno's almost kind of waiting and seeing in a way, and then he'll make that change to the back three. I would expect him to do that though. And obviously, as you mentioned, he did it at Wolves. It paid off. He got them into Europe with a back three. So I think he will eventually transform it over to Forest. It just depends how long it takes, and obviously whether, I'm sure Moreno will kind of fit nicely into that. I think that does us nicely. We've covered quite a bit. Dan, appreciate the insight into him, and hopefully he does score against Villa.
Can't wait. It's a load. Leave us alone. He cannot score against Villa, right?
You never know.
I'd love him to have a decent season because he's effectively surplus to requirements now. So I want Forest to sign him permanently. I want you to see enough to activate whatever that fee is. So here's hoping he has a good season for both of us.
So that was Dan there talking in quite some detail about Moreno, and interesting of what he says as well about kind of the injury knocking him back, but he thinks that he's going to be a good fit for Forest. So fingers crossed. Mark, just before we go, just wanted to quickly get your view on how you think Forest will set up defensively. I mentioned to Dan actually about how, it might be the case that Ole Aina moves to right back and Moreno becomes first choice left back. Can you see that happening, or do you think that's kind of slightly unfair on obviously Nico Williams as well?
No, I could see that happening. And also there's been speculation around Nico Williams' future, right? Clubs have shown interest in him, and I don't think it's beyond the realms of possibility that he could leave the City ground before the transfer window closes. I hope not. As we talked about many times, we feel like he was one of the best players for Forest this last season. Had a bit of a rough start, in my opinion, against Bournemouth, but again, up against a really tricky and quick winger. So that was definitely a rude awakening to the new season for him. But I'd like to see us, as I mentioned before the piece with Dan, I'd love to see us have depth in those fullback positions, have options. And I think Moreno, will contribute to that. And I'd love to see those guys all competing for those various places. I also think as well, Max, having another player, Nico Williams on the one side, Moreno on the other, who we know can get up the field really well, which is something that Aina doesn't do quite as much, is really important in those situations where we do go to a back three and we're asking those fullbacks to really bomb on. I think it gives Nuno lots of options. I'm excited about Moreno coming in, and as I mentioned, I'm not sure he'll start against Southampton, but we will see.
Good signing, in my opinion. Right, that does us nicely for our chat on all things Alex Moreno. Hope you did enjoy. Thanks to producer Dan for not only editing the podcast and keeping us, keeping me and Mark at bay and making sure we don't do anything silly, but also for giving us his insight from a Villa point of view. So best of luck to Villa as well. Be interesting to see how they do this season, and of course we'll get Dan back on when Forest face Villa in the next few months. Right, that does us nicely. Give us a like, share and subscribe on YouTube. Follow us across Spotify and Apple Podcasts if you did enjoy. Also leave us a review, really helps the podcast, gets us out there on Apple and everything like that. So do that for us. It's greatly appreciated, and we shall see you soon. From me and Mark, come on you Reds.